Hey guys, tonight we step back into a world that is often painted as noble and heroic. But when you slow down and pay attention to the small details, you'll see it was far less glorious. We're going to ancient Sparta, a place of rigid discipline, constant fear, and harsh realities that few of us today would want to endure. The stone streets are dusty, the mountain winds are sharp, and life here is stripped of almost every softness you take for granted. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you think of Sparta, you probably imagine rows of bronze-clad warriors, their shields locked in perfect formation. But before any Spartan could even dream of becoming one of those soldiers, they had to survive the beginning of life. And for many, that wasn't guaranteed. Spartan society was obsessed with strength and survival, and that obsession began from the very moment of birth. Unlike in other Greek city-states, where a newborn might be welcomed with family rituals or placed in a cradle with charms, Spartans subjected their infants to a communal inspection. It wasn't the parents who had the final say in whether a child would live. That decision rested with the elders of the city. A baby was carried to a place called the Lesh, a public building where the council of elders met. There the men examined the child carefully. Was it strong? Did it look healthy? Were its limbs straight? Any signs of weakness or deformity were considered dangerous to the community as a whole. A Spartan who could not one day fight, farm, or bear sent. Wrong children was seen as a burden. If the elders judged the infant unfit, it could be left in a chasm at the base of Mount Taygetus. The mountain's deep ravines served as a kind of natural graveyard, though scholars still debate how often children were actually abandoned versus quietly raised in secret by desperate parents or taken in by outsiders. Still, the fact remains. The message was clear. In Sparta, life itself began as a test. And if you think that sounds grim, remember, the state was valued more than the individual. A child wasn't truly theirs in the way you might expect today. They belonged to the community, and their worth was measured by what they could eventually contribute. Once accepted, the infant was still not coddled. Spartan parenting manuals didn't exist, but later accounts suggest that mothers avoided swaddling their babies tightly, a practice common elsewhere in Greece. They wanted their infants' limbs to grow free and strong. Babies were bathed not only in water, but sometimes in wine, a crude test believed to reveal hidden weakness or epilepsy. Imagine being a few weeks old and plunged into a mixture that stung your skin and nose, with watchful eyes looking for any signs of distress. Survive that, and your training had already begun. In the household, daily life was stripped of luxuries. Spartan families lived simply, often in homes with clay floors and modest furnishings. While other Greek cities indulged in painted pottery, fine fabrics, or elaborate banquets, Spartan households were expected to remain austere. Even the food was plain: coarse bread, porridge, and later the infamous black broth, a mix of boiled pork, blood, and vinegar that became a lifelong staple. For children, meals were small, meant to train them not to rely on abundance. Now picture the rhythms of early life in Sparta. The sun rising over the Taygetus mountains, the narrow streets filled with dust kicked up by livestock, the voices of women giving orders to slaves who were mostly helots, the subjugated people who did most of the farming and manual labor. Spartan mothers, unlike in many other places, weren't confined to the private sphere. They managed estates, oversaw agricultural production, and were expected to be physically strong themselves. They trained in running, wrestling, and discus throwing, not for their own sake, but because strong mothers were believed to produce stronger children. For a Spartan child, that meant your mother could very well wrestle you to the ground or demand you run alongside her in the fields. Discipline started at home, but the home itself was only temporary. At age 7, boys would be removed from their families entirely to enter the agoge, the state-run education and training system. But until then, their lives were already shaped by an atmosphere of hardness, frugality, and constant observation. One of the less glamorous details of Spartan life was hygiene. Soap, as we know it, didn't exist. Olive oil served as a kind of cleanser, rubbed onto the skin and then scraped off with a curved tool called a strigil. But for children, bathing was limited. Dirt and discomfort weren't seen as problems. In fact, they were useful. A child who could handle grime and itchiness without complaint was learning endurance. The idea of toughening up was woven into every small act. The seasons, too, dictated much of the daily rhythm. Winters in Sparta could be bitter, with cold winds sweeping down from the mountains. Spartan children were not given warm clothing or heavy blankets. Instead, they were expected to adapt. Exposure to the elements was considered part of building resilience. Summer brought heat and dust, when fields demanded constant labor from helots and oversight from Spartan citizens. Even children absorbed this cycle, watching as the adults around them treated hardship as normal. And then there's the subtle detail that rarely makes it into popular portrayals. Boredom. For all the talk of military might, a Spartan child's early years weren't filled with non-stop training. They were slow, repetitive, and often dull. Days revolved around simple meals, listening to adults speak in clipped tones, helping with minor chores, and learning through observation. Toys existed, but they were crude. Small figures carved from wood, pebbles used in games, or makeshift rattles. No bright colors, no elaborate stories painted onto ceramics like in Athens. Entertainment was minimal. The point wasn't to spark imagination, but to cultivate self-control. This steady rhythm of scarcity, silence, and supervision created a certain kind of personality. A Spartan child learned early that they weren't supposed to stand out. Talking too much, eating too eagerly, or showing fear could bring scorn. Instead, they were taught to endure, to blend into the collective, to prepare for a life in which individuality was often seen as weakness. Yet even in this rigid system, the human element lingered. Mothers still sang lullabies, children still played, even if their games sometimes mimicked the harshness of adult life. Wrestling, racing barefoot over rough ground, or daring each other to withstand pain. There were small moments of warmth, like a child sitting close to a hearth fire on a cold night, or the taste of fresh figs during harvest season. These details remind us that even in Sparta, life was not unending cruelty. It was just that softness was rationed, given sparingly, and always with the understanding that it could not last. So by the time a Spartan boy approached his 7th birthday, he had already lived a life more demanding than what many adults in other Greek cities experienced. His body was tested, his diet restricted, his environment deliberately uncomfortable. He was prepared in small ways for the severing of family bonds that was about to come. And this raises the question, when the state finally took these boys away from their families and placed them in the agoge, what did daily life there really look like? Was it all endless drills and shouting, or something quieter, stranger, and perhaps even more exhausting? At the age of 7, everything changed. For a Spartan boy, this was the moment when childhood ended and public duty began. On his birthday, or soon after, he was taken from his home and delivered into the custody of the state. The agoge was not just a school in the modern sense. It was a carefully structured program of discipline, deprivation, and indoctrination. To survive it was to become a Spartan. To fail was to invite shame. Imagine it from the child's perspective. One day you're eating bread at your mother's table, perhaps listening to her issue instructions to servants or watching her oversee the olive harvest. The next, you're standing with a group of other boys, dressed in a single garment, your head perhaps shaved, and everything familiar has been stripped away. The family bond that had shaped your early years is replaced by the authority of older youths and state-appointed overseers. From this point forward, your life is no longer your own. The structure of the agoge revolved around small groups called elai, or packs. Each boy was assigned to one of these units, typically numbering around 60. Within the pack, hierarchy was strictly observed. The younger boys obeyed the older ones, and even the older boys were under the constant watch of adult supervisors called paidonomoi. These men had near absolute authority to punish, direct, or test the boys under their care. The daily rhythm was deliberately harsh. Boys slept together, not in beds, but on simple mats, or even directly on reeds that they were expected to gather themselves from riverbanks. In winter, they had only a thin cloak for warmth. Blankets were not provided. The intent was clear: to teach the body to endure cold, fatigue, and exposure. Complaining was not only useless, it was dangerous. Any sign of weakness might invite mockery or worse. Food was equally controlled. Meals were simple and deliberately insufficient. A boy might receive a small portion of barley porridge, cheese, or the dreaded black broth. The portions were never quite enough to satisfy. Hunger was an intentional teacher. It forced the boys to learn resourcefulness. They were encouraged, quietly and without official sanction, to steal food in order to fill their stomachs. But if caught, the punishment was severe. Not because stealing was wrong, but because getting caught revealed a failure in stealth and cunning. In this way, the agoge cultivated skills beyond physical strength: secrecy, deception, and the ability to survive on less. Education in the narrow sense was also part of the system. Spartan boys did learn to read and write, though not with the same emphasis as in Athens. Literacy was functional, not ornamental. The real focus was on memorization, music, and oral instruction. Boys were trained to recite poetry, particularly the martial verses of Tertius, whose grim battle hymns became the soundtrack of Spartan life. Through repetition, they internalized ideals of courage, endurance, and obedience. At the same time, they were drilled in brevity of speech. The famous laconic style, short, sharp, and cutting remarks, was cultivated from an early age. Boys were taught to answer questions with as few words as possible, a skill that became a kind of cultural trademark. Imagine being corrected every time you spoke at length, until silence and sharp wit became second nature. For a people who valued action over rhetoric, this conciseness was both a discipline and a defense. Physical training was relentless. Boys ran barefoot, wrestled, boxed, and engaged in mock battles. Their bodies were hardened through repetition, bruises, and exhaustion. Athletics were not simply games, but survival exercises. Running prepared them for the forced marches of war. Wrestling built strength and taught control in close combat. Even dance, which seems out of place at first, was used as a form of drill, emphasizing rhythm, coordination, and group cohesion. Punishments were frequent and often brutal. A boy who faltered in drills, who showed fear, or who disobeyed an order could be whipped without warning. The pain was intended not just as correction, but as preparation. Later, in public festivals, boys would be flogged at the altar of Artemis Orthia, sometimes until they collapsed. Enduring pain without complaint was seen as proof of Spartan steel. Parents sometimes watched these ceremonies, encouraging their sons not to cry out. To modern ears it sounds cruel, but to Spartans it was a ritual demonstration of values they considered essential. One of the more overlooked aspects of the agoge was how it cultivated surveillance. Boys were constantly watched, by elders, by peers, by each other. Privacy scarcely existed. Even in sleep, a boy might be checked on to ensure he was not shivering too openly under his thin cloak. This atmosphere of perpetual scrutiny taught conformity, but it also built a kind of collective vigilance. You learned early that your reputation was never your own secret. Everyone knew, and everyone judged. The seasons shaped the difficulty of the training. In winter, hunger was sharper, the cold more biting. In summer, the boys trained under harsh sunlight, their skin burned and blistered with little relief. Each season tested them differently. And year after year the lessons accumulated: hunger, pain, obedience, and the constant reminder that their lives were not their own, but belonged to Sparta. Yet, amid all this severity, there were glimpses of normal youth. Boys formed friendships and rivalries. They competed for recognition, for the approval of older boys, for the praise of their superiors. They played games, though often rough ones, involving wrestling matches or ball games with violent scrums. Laughter existed, even in this grim environment, though it was often at someone else's expense. Some relationships between older and younger boys went beyond mentorship, taking on the form of pederastic bonds that were common in Greek culture, though in Sparta these were tied closely to military discipline. Older youths were expected to serve as role models, shaping the younger into disciplined warriors. Whether these bonds were affectionate, exploitative, or both varied, but they formed another layer of social cohesion and another way the state inserted itself into personal development. By the age of 12, the program intensified. The thin cloak became the only garment worn year-round. No shoes were allowed, forcing the boys' feet to harden against rough terrain. Bathing was restricted. Hair was cropped short. At night, they slept in the open, enduring cold, insects, and the constant discomfort of stone or reed bedding. The lack of comfort was not a temporary challenge, but a permanent condition. Spartan boys grew up without softness. By now, the boys were also expected to hunt and forage. Gathering reeds for bedding, snaring small animals, or finding wild plants became part of survival. They were deliberately underfed, so they had to steal to survive, but stealthily. If caught, they faced whippings, sometimes administered in front of their peers. These whippings could be merciless, yet crying out in pain was forbidden. The ability to suffer silently was praised as the highest form of courage. As the boys aged toward their mid-teens, competition increased. The agoge was not just about creating soldiers in general, but about identifying the best. Exceptional boys might be chosen for leadership roles within their groups, expected to set an example in endurance and obedience. Those who failed, who broke under the pressure or displayed cowardice, could be marginalized or ridiculed. The shame of failure was not easily erased. In a society obsessed with honor, and even childhood shortcomings could cast a long shadow, the communal aspect of life remained constant. Meals were eaten together, training was endured together, punishments were shared. Individual comfort was always sacrificed for the group. Through this, the Spartan sense of unity was forged. When later they stood shield to shield in battle, this early training had already taught them that their own survival depended on the discipline of the man beside them. And yet, even with all of this, it's worth remembering how narrow their education was. While Athenians studied philosophy, rhetoric, and art, Spartans drilled endlessly in silence and obedience. The boys knew little of geometry or science. Their world was reduced to the essentials of survival and war. To outsiders, this made Spartans seem crude. To themselves, it was proof that they valued action over words. By 14, a boy had endured 7 years of hunger, beatings, cold, and constant discipline. He had learned to steal, to endure, to speak little, and to obey much. But the agoge was not finished. Ahead lay even harsher tests as he entered his mid-teens, and the line between boy and soldier began to blur. And this leads us to the next stage. When these nearly grown youths, already hardened by deprivation, were pushed into more dangerous training, where secrecy, violence, and even sanctioned killing began to appear, what did it mean to grow from a boy of the agoge into a Spartan on the edge of manhood? By the time a Spartan boy reached the age of 15, he was no longer simply a child enduring discipline. He was now on the edge of adulthood, and the demands placed on him grew even more intense. The early years of deprivation had been a preparation, a slow stripping away of comfort and individuality. What followed was a sharpening of that training, pushing him toward the life of a permanent soldier. One of the most visible changes was participation in the syssitia, the communal mess halls where Spartan males ate together. From adolescence onward, meals were no longer taken at home with family. Instead, the young men joined groups of about 15 citizens who dined collectively every night. Each member was expected to contribute monthly to the mess: barley, cheese, figs, and most importantly, meat. Wealthier Spartans could supplement the fare, while poorer ones might struggle to provide their share. Failure to contribute was grounds for expulsion, a disgrace that could mean exclusion from full citizenship. The meals themselves were simple, monotonous, and deliberately unappealing. The notorious melos zomos, or black broth, formed the centerpiece. This dark, vinegary pork stew was a staple, often accompanied by barley bread and little else. Visitors from other Greek cities mocked its taste. One story claimed that when a visitor from Syracuse tried it, he remarked that only Spartans could enjoy such a dish because, after tasting it, death would seem preferable. For the Spartan youths, eating this nightly was a lesson in endurance. It reminded them that food was fuel, not pleasure. But the syssitia were not only about eating. They were about learning how to exist within a collective. Conversation was restricted, wit was valued, and discipline was enforced even in the act of dining. A boy at the table was judged on how he spoke, how he handled his food, and wet to hers. Her he showed restraint. In this way, the mess became another training ground for character. Beyond meals, the daily routine of a 15-year-old Spartan intensified. Physical training reached new levels of rigor. They ran long distances barefoot over rocky terrain, lifted weights made from stone, and wrestled in sandpits until their bodies were caked in dust and sweat. Drills with spear and shield became more regular, teaching them the coordination and stamina required for the phalanx formation. Every movement was practiced again and again, until muscle memory took over. Endurance was constantly tested. Boys were sent on extended exercises with little food, expected to forage or steal what they needed without detection. Sleeping rough was common, often without even a cloak to ward off the night air. Winter was especially brutal: frost-bitten feet, chapped hands, and the cutting winds of the Eurotas Valley. To survive, the youths learned to huddle together for warmth, or simply endure the shivering until dawn. At this stage, punishments became harsher. Whippings were more frequent, sometimes administered in front of the entire group as a warning. Silence during punishment was still mandatory. Even more telling was the use of ridicule. Public shame was wielded like a weapon. A boy who failed to endure pain, who faltered during a run, or who showed fear could be mocked mercilessly by his peers and superiors. In a society where honor was everything, this humiliation could sting longer than the lash. By 16, many boys were introduced to the most secretive and feared institution of Spartan life, the crypteia. This was a kind of shadow training, described by ancient writers as both a survival exercise and a form of state terror. Selected youths, usually the strongest, cleverest, and most ruthless, were sent into the countryside armed only with knives. By day, they hid in the fields, surviving on whatever they could scavenge. By night, they roamed the land, targeting the helots, the enslaved population who farmed for Sparta. The purpose was not only to instill toughness in the boys, but also to keep the helots in constant fear of sudden violence. The crypteia blurred the line between training and cruelty. Youths crept through villages, killing helots at random or eliminating those considered troublesome. To outsiders, this was state-sanctioned murder. To Spartans, it was both population control and a way to harden young men into ruthless warriors. The secrecy of the practice made it all the more terrifying. A boy chosen for the crypteia was no longer just enduring hardship. He was practicing the art of stealth, intimidation, and lethal violence. Not every boy was selected, of course. Those who were not still underwent rigorous training, but the knowledge that some of their peers were out in the fields at night, hunting men, added a layer of unease to daily life. It reinforced the sense that Sparta was built on a delicate balance of control, maintained only through constant vigilance and fear. At 17, the distinction between boy and soldier grew faint. training now included mock battles with real weapons, though the points might be blunted. Shields grew heavier, armor more cumbersome. Marching drills stretched for hours, sometimes days, teaching the importance of rhythm and formation. To break rank or stumble under the weight of your shield was unthinkable. In the phalanx, discipline mattered more than individual strength. The shield you carried was not only for you, but for the man beside you. This period also marked a sharpening of social roles. Boys competed fiercely for recognition, seeking the approval of older warriors. The best might be recruited as attendants to seasoned soldiers, learning directly from veterans about the realities of campaign life. These mentorships were prized, as they offered both protection and prestige. They were also another reminder that a Spartan youth's path was not his own. His future was shaped by the judgments of his superiors. Outside of training, the daily grind remained harsh. Clothing was still minimal, baths rare, food plain. Time not spent drilling was often spent in silence, or reciting poetry, or listening to elders recount lessons of past wars. Storytelling in Sparta was not entertainment but indoctrination. The legends of Thermopylae and Plataea, the verses of Tyrtaeus, the sayings of former kings, these became the text from which Spartan youths learned their place in history. What about the inner life of these young men? It's difficult to know. Few wrote about their feelings, and even fewer survived to tell us. But we can imagine the monotony, the exhaustion, the occasional flicker of longing for home. They must have missed the warmth of their mothers' hearths, the taste of figs in season, the comfort of blankets. But those longings had to be crushed. To speak them aloud would invite ridicule. Silence became their shield, as much as bronze ever would. By the age of 19, the training was nearly complete. These young men were hardened, skilled, and disciplined. They could run barefoot for miles, endure hunger for days, fight with spear and shield until their muscles screamed. They had been shaped into tools of the state, stripped of individuality, bound to each other through shared suffering. But one final transition remained. At 20, they would be considered full members of the army, eligible to fight in real campaigns. The boy would vanish, and the soldier would take his place. And so, as a Spartan youth prepared to cross that threshold, the questions loomed. What did it mean to finally enter the ranks as a man? How did the state mark the transition from endless training to actual warfare? And what place, if any, was left for the faint memory of childhood after more than a decade of deprivation? At the age of 20, a Spartan's long childhood of deprivation finally ended, or at least it shifted into a new form. From this point forward, he was no longer just a trainee or an adolescent under constant supervision. He was a soldier of the Spartan state, fully expected to live and die for his city. Yet in reality, life at 20 was less a liberation and more an intensification of the obligations he had already carried since boyhood. The transition into adulthood was marked not by personal freedom, but by enrollment into the army and into the political life of the community. At 20, a Spartan could now serve as a full-time hoplite in the phalanx. He was expected to be available for campaigns at any time, ready to march across the Peloponnese or beyond at the command of the state. Campaigning was not glamorous. It meant carrying heavy armor under the summer sun, eating coarse rations on the move, and sleeping in makeshift camps on rocky soil. The lessons of hunger, cold, and endurance drilled into him since childhood were now put to practical use. But entry into the ranks was not automatic. Full citizenship, the status of a homoios or equal, depended on continued participation in the syssitia, the communal mess halls. Every month, each man had to contribute his share of food: barley, wine, cheese, figs, and a portion of meat. Without this contribution, a man risked losing his place among the equals, a disgrace worse than poverty. Citizenship in Sparta was not a birthright alone. It was something that had to be maintained through constant duty. The syssitia continued to shape daily life, even after the rigors of the agoge. Every evening, Spartan men gathered to share the same plain meal, sitting side by side with their comrades. Conversation was measured, laughter rare, and discipline still enforced. For a man in his 20s, this routine must have felt like an extension of adolescence. No dinners at home, no private feasts, only the relentless sameness of communal eating. Even marriage did not exempt him. A young husband was expected to sneak away from his bride after nightfall, returning to his mess hall to dine with his fellow soldiers. Only after the age of 30 could a man eat regularly at home. Until then, the state held him firmly within its grip. The communal structure also meant that individuality was still suppressed. A man's reputation in his mess group carried great weight. To be lazy, gluttonous, or cowardly was to invite mockery, not only in private, but sometimes in public assemblies. Shame was one of Sparta's most powerful tools of control. It was easier to bear hunger, cold, and bruises than the sting of dishonor. Military life itself was constant. The phalanx was the beating heart of Spartan identity, and every young man trained daily to maintain its precision. The shield wall required absolute trust. You held your shield not only to protect yourself, but to cover the man beside you. A single lapse could open a gap that endangered the entire unit. For this reason, desertion or cowardice was unthinkable. The shame of dropping one's shield, even if a man kept his spear, was considered unforgivable. Ancient sources preserve sayings attributed to Spartan mothers, telling their sons to return with your shield or on it. Whether or not those exact words were ever spoken, the sentiment captures the essence of the society. Survival was less important than honor. Campaigns abroad reinforced the grim lessons of training. Food supplies often ran short. Water was scarce during long marches. Armor weighed heavily. A hoplite's panoply might include a bronze breastplate, helmet, greaves, shield, and spear, together weighing upward of 60 pounds. Marching across rough terrain with this burden demanded the endurance that only years of deprivation could produce. At night, soldiers slept on bare ground, their cloaks pulled tight against the chill. For Spartans, this was not an extraordinary hardship, but simply life as usual. Alongside military obligations, the social structure of Sparta became more pronounced in adulthood. The population of full citizens, those with equal rights in the assembly and the army, was always small, and by the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, it was shrinking. To be part of this elite group was a privilege fiercely guarded, but it also came with constant pressure. Every citizen was reminded daily that he lived on the labor of others, the helots who worked the land, producing the grain, wine, and oil that sustained Spartan society. Without the helots, the Spartan lifestyle would have collapsed. Yet the constant threat of helot rebellion meant that every citizen soldier had to remain vigilant. This vigilance shaped the psychology of adulthood. A Spartan man knew that his role was not only to fight foreign enemies, but also to intimidate the enslaved majority within his own borders. The annual declaration of war on the helots by the ephors, Sparta's magistrates, was a symbolic reminder that violence against them was not only permitted, but expected. For a young man fresh from the agoge, the message was clear. His adulthood was built on both external defense and internal domination. Marriage added another layer of complexity. Spartan men typically married in their 20s, but their relationships were shaped by the state's priorities. Husbands were expected to visit their wives discreetly, often at night, until they reached the age of 30. This peculiar custom was thought to keep men focused on military life rather than domestic comfort. It also produced a certain tension. Intimacy was rationed, just as food and warmth had been. Wives managed households and estates in their husbands' absence, reinforcing the unusual power and independence of Spartan women compared to their counterparts elsewhere in Greece. Children born into these marriages faced the same harsh cycle of examination, training, and deprivation that their fathers had endured. In this way, the system perpetuated itself. Each generation was raised to believe that hardship was natural, that comfort was suspicious, and that the survival of the state mattered more than individual desire. Political participation also began around this age. A man could attend the apella, the Spartan assembly, where citizens voted on proposals made by the Council of Elders. The assembly had limited power, but attendance was mandatory for full citizens. Decisions were made not through speeches and debates, as in Athens, but through shouting. The louder group determined the outcome. This method reflected Sparta's distrust of rhetoric and preference for blunt, collective decision-making. For a young man who had spent his life trained to remain silent and concise, it was another reminder that speech in Sparta was never about persuasion, only about obedience and consensus. As adulthood settled in, the routines of a Spartan life were clear. Endless military drills, communal meals, readiness for campaign, and vigilance against revolt. There were no careers beyond soldiering. There was little chance for personal ambition outside the narrow avenues of military achievement or rare political influence. A man's identity was bound to his role, as a hoplite and his participation in the collective. And yet, this system produced cracks over time. By the late 5th century BCE, Sparta's citizen population had declined sharply, partly due to the relentless demands placed on each generation. War, infertility, and the economic burden of maintaining contributions to the mess halls all eroded the numbers of full citizens. The very system designed to preserve Spartan strength gradually weakened it. For the individual, this meant even more pressure. Every citizen was a valuable resource, his absence a blow to the collective. There was no space for failure, illness, or retreat. Reflecting on this, we can see why ancient writers often admired Sparta's discipline, but also noted its limitations. A society built on relentless hardness could produce formidable soldiers, but at the cost of variety, creativity, and personal freedom. The training of childhood left scars that adulthood never healed. Men learned to endure, but not to flourish in the broader sense. They were respected and feared, but also trapped in a system that offered no escape. As we close this first story, it's worth asking, what did this upbringing leave behind? For the men who lived it, the legacy was one of exhaustion, repetition, and control. For the broader world, Sparta became a symbol, sometimes admired, sometimes criticized, of what happens when a society sacrifices everything to military discipline. And yet, the question lingers. Did the Spartans themselves believe their lives were worth it? Or did they simply endure, generation after generation, because no other way seemed possible? The story of Sparta does not belong only to the men. While boys were molded in the agoge, their mothers, sisters, and wives lived lives no less shaped by the needs of the state. Spartan women were unusual in the Greek world. They were more visible, more outspoken, and more independent than their counterparts in cities like Athens. Yet their freedom was never absolute. It existed only because the state demanded it. From the very beginning, a girl's life in Sparta was marked by difference. At birth, she too faced the scrutiny of the elders. Although the inspection of female infants was less notorious than that of males, the principle remained. Weak or deformed children could be rejected. A healthy daughter was not a disappointment in Sparta because women played a crucial role in the survival of the system. They were not secluded in inner chambers or restricted to weaving looms. Instead, they were expected to manage households, direct labor, and produce strong children. Childhood for a Spartan girl was freer than in many other Greek poleis. Instead of being confined indoors, she grew up running in the open fields, often alongside boys in early years. Physical training was encouraged, even demanded. Girls ran races, wrestled, practiced throwing the javelin, and danced in festivals with athletic vigor. Their bodies were considered part of the state's resources. A strong woman would give birth to strong sons, and that was the ultimate purpose of her strength. Training was not purely physical. Girls also participated in musical and choral performances at religious festivals. These were not casual entertainments, but public displays of discipline and unity, echoing the military drills of the boys. Choral songs often carried themes of war and valor, reminding even young girls that their value was tied to the battlefield, not as combatants, but as the mothers of future hop. Well, it is. The seasons dictated their routines as much as for boys. In summer, training outdoors was relentless, under the harsh Peloponnesian sun. In winter, cloaks and light garments offered little protection against the cold winds sweeping down from Mount Taygetus. The constant exposure hardened them, reinforcing the belief that comfort was dangerous. Property rights were another striking difference. Unlike Athenian women, who could not own land in their own names, Spartan women could inherit and manage property. Over time, they came to control significant portions of the Spartan economy, especially as the number of male citizens dwindled in prolonged wars. A woman might oversee large estates worked by helot laborers, giving her authority unusual in the ancient Greek world. Yet this authority was not entirely her own. She managed wealth not for personal enrichment, but to maintain the household's ability to contribute to the syssitia and support the state's military obligations. Marriage customs reveal still more about how women were folded into the system. Spartan girls typically married later than in Athens, often around 18, compared to Athenian brides as young as 14. The later age likely reflected the emphasis on physical maturity, ensuring that women were fully grown and thus more likely to bear healthy children. Marriage rituals themselves could be unusual. In some accounts, the bride's hair was cut short, and she was dressed in men's clothing before being carried off by her husband. This symbolic gesture blurred gender distinctions, reminding both partners that marriage in Sparta was not about romance, but about function, the production of future citizens. Despite the apparent independence of Spartan women, their lives were deeply entwined with the state's military priorities. Husbands spent most of their time with their mess groups or on campaign, leaving women to run households largely alone. This absence granted them practical autonomy, but it also meant a life of constant responsibility. They managed resources, oversaw helot laborers, and made sure the household's contributions to the mess hall were met. The pressure was immense. A lapse in household management could mean social disgrace for the entire family. Spartan women also lived under the same culture of shame and honor as men. Their reputations were tied not only to their own behavior, but to the actions of their sons and husbands. A woman whose son died bravely in battle was celebrated. A woman whose son fled or failed was disgraced. Inscriptions and later anecdotes preserve sharp, laconic sayings attributed to Spartan women, urging their sons to return with your shield or on it. Whether or not these sayings were ever truly spoken in such terms, they capture the essence of a culture that demanded hardness from both sexes. Religious life provided one of the few outlets for women's public participation. Spartan women took part in numerous festivals, often in prominent roles. At the festival of Hyacinthia, they joined in processions and sacrifices. At the festival of Artemis Orthia, girls competed in athletic contests, sometimes even in ritual floggings that paralleled the boys' ordeals. These events were more than ceremonies. They were public affirmations of discipline, endurance, and loyalty to the community. Daily life, however, was less dramatic. A Spartan woman's mornings might begin with overseeing the distribution of grain or oil to helot workers. She would direct the tasks of the day, tending to vineyards, harvesting olives, maintaining storage jars, or preparing contributions for the mess hall. Unlike in Athens, where women rarely appeared in public, Spartan women moved about openly, giving orders, inspecting fields and participating in social gatherings. They were visible figures in the community, their presence reinforcing the idea that Sparta's strength depended on both sexes acting in concert. And yet, even in this relative freedom, constraints remained. Spartan women did not engage in trade or crafts. They did not write poetry or philosophy, at least not in ways that reached us. Their education was limited to what served the state: physical vigor, discipline, household management, and the reproduction of strong heirs. Personal desires were rarely considered. Life was defined by service to the collective. The contradiction of their position is striking. On one hand, they enjoyed rights and visibility rare in the ancient world. On the other, their lives were still bound by the same relentless system that shaped the men. Their independence was not freedom in the modern sense, but a carefully structured necessity born of the militarized state. By the end of childhood, then, a Spartan girl had become a woman prepared not for personal fulfillment, but for public duty. Her body, her household, her reputation, all belonged in some way to Sparta. And yet, her daily tasks remained ordinary, counting grain, tending vines, watching over children, exchanging clipped remarks with neighbors in the marketplace. The extraordinary image of Spartan women that fascinated outsiders was built on these small, repetitive acts. But this raises a question. Once these women had taken on the responsibility of estates and households, how exactly did they manage the endless labor required to keep the Spartan machine running, especially when most of that labor fell to the helots? What did the daily rhythms of agricultural life look like under their supervision? And how did they navigate the tension between dependence and control? To understand the life of a Spartan woman beyond her training and public reputation, you must imagine the quieter, slower hours that filled most of her days. Though she could walk in public and give orders with authority, the rhythm of her existence was dominated by tasks as old as farming itself. Sparta, unlike bustling Athens, had little commerce or craftsmanship to occupy its citizens. Its wealth was tied to the land, and the management of that land fell heavily upon the shoulders of its women. The fertile valleys of Laconia and Messenia provided the resources upon which the Spartan state relied. Olive groves lined the slopes, vineyards stretched across the plains, and fields of barley and wheat ripened in their seasons. The work of sowing, tending, and harvesting was carried out by helots, the enslaved population bound to the land. Yet their labor did not run itself. It required oversight, scheduling, and constant vigilance against waste, neglect, or rebellion. Spartan women filled this supervisory role, acting as managers of estates that were both households and engines of the military system. Each season demanded different duties. In autumn, when olives were harvested, a woman might walk the groves with helot workers, inspecting the baskets as they filled and ensuring the presses functioned smoothly. The oil produced was not only for cooking, but also for religious offerings, lamps, and the lubrication of armor and shields. In winter, attention shifted to maintaining stores. Jars of oil sealed with wax, amphorae of wine resting in cool storage pits, grain kept dry and safe from rodents. Spring required a return to the fields. Barley was sown early, with women ensuring the helots followed the proper rhythms of ploughing, scattering, and covering seed. Vines needed pruning, and irrigation channels had to be cleared after winter rains. Summer brought its own charl. Engers. Heat threatened both crops and workers, and women had to balance the demands of harvest with the management of household stores. These seasonal duties may sound dull, but without them, Sparta's soldiers would have no food to eat, no oil for their bodies, no wine for their mess halls. The proud discipline of the hoplite depended on the ordinary routines carried out by women and their helot laborers. Supervision of helots was no simple matter. Though they vastly outnumbered the Spartans, helots were kept in subjection through fear, ritualized violence, and constant surveillance. Women played their part in this system. They directed the labor, set quotas, and sometimes enforced discipline themselves. A helot who shirked work or failed to deliver expected amounts of grain could endanger not only the household, but its standing within the community. Women therefore bore the responsibility of ensuring compliance without provoking outright rebellion. It was a delicate balance. Too much cruelty could invite resistance. Too much leniency could invite waste or inefficiency. The agricultural economy also tied women to the communal dining system, the syssitia. Every male Spartan citizen was required to contribute a fixed amount of food, grain, wine, cheese, and meat, to his mess group. Failure to provide this contribution could mean loss of full citizenship. Since men spent most of their lives away from home, the burden of assembling these contributions fell to their wives or mothers. Ensuring that the household produced enough to meet these quotas was among the most important duties of a Spartan woman. It was a logistical task as much as an agricultural one, requiring careful planning and storage. Inside the household, management extended beyond food production. Linen and wool garments, though simple, had to be produced and maintained. Unlike in Athens, where women spent much of their time weaving, Spartan women were less confined to the loom. but they still bore responsibility for clothing. Garments were plain, but they required spinning, dyeing, and sewing. Leather sandals needed repair. Household tools, clay jars, wooden utensils, bronze cauldrons had to be maintained, traded for, or replaced. Women organized these mundane but vital activities, often relying on helot artisans or traveling traders who were permitted limited commerce within Sparta. Religious duties also intertwined with daily management. Women prepared offerings of barley meal or small cakes for household shrines, ensuring the favor of the gods upon their families and fields. During larger festivals, they contributed sacrificial animals or prepared feasts that reinforced communal bonds. Religion in Sparta was not merely ritual. It was another layer of discipline, another way in which ordinary actions were folded into the survival of the state. Social expectations magnified the pressure of these duties. A woman who managed her estate poorly might cause her husband's mess group to lack provisions, bringing shame upon the family. Conversely, a woman who oversaw her resources well earned respect, not only for herself, but for her household's contribution to the collective. Outsiders often remarked on the boldness of Spartan women's speech, their willingness to chastise men or boast of their household strength. These sharp words were backed by the reality of their authority over land and resources. Yet this authority did not mean comfort. The life of estate management was filled with monotony and tension. Each day involved checking stores, directing helots, monitoring fields, and balancing silos. Contributions. Natural disasters added further strain. A poor harvest could not easily be supplemented through trade, since Sparta lacked a robust marketplace. Droughts, floods, or plagues among livestock could jeopardize an entire household's standing. Women bore the brunt of these crises, improvising solutions while their husbands drilled, trained, or campaigned far from home. The broader political structure reinforced this burden. Because men devoted themselves almost entirely to military life, women became, in practice, the economic backbone of Sparta. This reality created an unusual dynamic. While men were celebrated for their martial discipline, their survival depended on the effective management carried out by women at home. Foreign observers noticed this contradiction. To some, it appeared that Spartan women were free and dominant. To others, it was clear that their authority was constrained, functional, and always oriented towards sustaining the state. And always in the background loomed the helots. Without their labor, none of this system would function. Women might supervise, plan, and direct, but the actual physical labor of plowing, harvesting, pressing, and hauling fell on the enslaved population. The uneasy dependence on helots infused every aspect of Spartan life with tension. A woman walking her fields was not only a manager of agriculture, she was also a warden, overseeing a workforce that lived in resentment. This uneasy coexistence shaped the psychology of both groups, reinforcing the rigid structure that kept Sparta balanced on the edge of stability and unrest. By the end of a day filled with these duties, a Spartan woman might sit with neighbors, sharing brief conversation about harvest yields, household contributions, or festival preparations. Even social life revolved around the economy and the state. Friendships were often measured in the abii, litty to share resources or lend support during difficult years. In such a system, personal leisure was rare, and individuality was subsumed into collective survival. So when we picture Spartan women striding boldly through their city, giving commands and speaking sharply, we must remember the weight behind their words. Their confidence rested on endless cycles of planting and harvesting, jars sealed against pests, helots kept in uneasy compliance, and contributions sent punctually to the mess halls. Without this steady labor, the Spartan state, with its legendary warriors and rigid discipline, would collapse. But how did these women transition from estate managers to wives and mothers? How did marriage, childbirth, and family economics fit into a system that demanded so much from them already? The answers lie not only in ritual and custom, but in the stark realities of population decline, inheritance disputes, and the relentless expectation that women's bodies would sustain the citizen class. Marriage in Sparta was not the soft, romantic affair you might imagine from modern stories. It was a carefully structured institution, designed less for love than for the preservation of the citizen body. At its core, Spartan marriage was about producing healthy offspring who could sustain the state's strict military and social system. For women, this meant that their bodies were considered vital resources, much like the fields and olive groves they managed. The rules, rituals, and expectations surrounding marriage revealed just how central reproduction was to Sparta's survival. The ceremony itself carried echoes of abduction. A young woman, usually in her late teens or early 20s, would be symbolically captured by her husband. She was taken from her family home, her hair cut short, and she was dressed in men's clothing or a simple cloak. This ritualized disguise blurred her identity, emphasizing the transition from girl to wife, from maiden to mother. After this mock abduction, the husband would visit her in secret, often at night, while continuing to live in his military barracks. Unlike in other Greek cities, Spartan men did not immediately establish independent households upon marriage. Their loyalty to their mess group and their fellow soldiers came first. This unusual arrangement meant that early marriages were often conducted in secrecy and restraint. Husbands would slip away from their barracks at night to spend brief hours with their wives before returning by dawn. To outsiders, this must have seemed strange. A married couple who did not live together openly. Yet the system served Sparta's priorities. Men remained bound to their military obligations, while women maintained their households largely alone. Over time, as men grew older and retired from the barracks, couples might live more openly, but the formative years of marriage were characterized by distance and duty. Childbirth lay at the center of this arrangement. A woman's success as a wife was measured not by her domestic skills or her charm, but by her ability to produce strong children. Infertility, whether caused by the man or the woman, carried heavy consequences. Sometimes arrangements were made for another man to father children with a woman whose husband could not. This was not considered scandalous in the way it might be in other societies. It was a practical response to Sparta's constant concern with maintaining the number of full citizens. The small size of the Spartan citizen body, never more than a few thousand, meant that every birth mattered. Pregnancy and childbirth, however, were dangerous. Ancient medicine was limited, and complications could easily prove fatal. Women were encouraged to stay physically strong, in the belief that a robust mother would produce robust children. Even so, many women died young, often in childbirth. For all their relative freedoms compared to other Greek women, Spartan wives bore a heavy physical burden. Each pregnancy was a gamble, balancing the survival of the individual against the survival of the state. The state's interest in childbirth extended to the very beginning of life. As with boys, infants were inspected shortly after birth to ensure their health. Those deemed weak or deformed might be exposed, left to die on the mountainside. This practice, harsh as it sounds to modern ears, reflected the Spartan focus on collective strength over individual sentiment. A woman who lost a child in this way endured both personal grief and the knowledge that her family had failed to contribute to the citizen body. Family economics were closely tied to marriage. Unlike in Athens, where dowries were customary, Spartan women often brought land into their marriages. Through inheritance and management, women controlled significant amounts of property. Some ancient writers claimed that women owned nearly 2/5 of Spartan land by the 4th century BCE. This was not because they were granted unusual rights in principle, but because the constant deaths of men in warfare and the smaller size of families concentrated property in the hands of surviving women. Inheritance disputes became a frequent issue. With land and property flowing through both male and female lines, questions of legitimacy, succession, and control often complicated family arrangements. Women might find themselves responsible not only for their own estates, but for those inherited from brothers, uncles, or fathers who died in battle. This gave them unusual leverage, but also tied them firmly to the fate of their family's holdings. Marriage was thus as much an economic alliance as a personal one. A union linked estates, secured contributions to the mess groups, and stabilized household resources. Women were central to this process, not only as wives but as heirs, managers, and when necessary, negotiators. Foreign observers were struck by the boldness of Spartan women's voices in public, but this boldness had practical roots. They were accustomed to handling property, managing estates, and speaking on matters that affected the survival of their households. Children who survived infancy were raised within this same web of duty. Sons were eventually taken into the agoge, the state-run training system, while daughters remained under their mother's guidance. A woman's responsibilities extended into the shaping of her children's early years. She prepared sons for the harsh training ahead, encouraging toughness and obedience. Daughters learned to manage households and estates, preparing for their own future roles as wives and mothers. Childhood in Sparta was brief, and parental affection was often filtered through the lens of state service. The expectations of mothers were stern. A famous saying attributed to Spartan women is that they handed their sons their shields with the words, "with it" or "on it," meaning that they should return victorious from battle or die honorably. Whether or not this phrase was ever truly spoken, it captures the cultural role of women as enforcers of Spartan discipline. They were not merely passive supporters of their husbands and sons, but active participants in shaping the values that sustained the state. Yet behind this image of stern resolve lay the ordinary struggles of family life. Raising children meant endless small tasks, feeding infants, clothing toddlers, organizing help from helot nurses or attendants, and teaching basic skills. These daily routines were not glamorous, but they were essential. In a society where the survival of each child mattered enormously, the ordinary care of mothers carried extraordinary weight. Still, the pressure of reproduction weighed heavily. Sparta's population steadily declined over the centuries, a fact noted by ancient observers and modern historians alike. Some point to the constant drain of warfare, others to the rigid restrictions on citizenship, which limited full membership to those who could trace their ancestry and meet economic obligations. Whatever the cause, the decline intensified the burden on women. Every marriage was scrutinized, every birth carried state significance, and every death left a gap that was difficult to fill. This dynamic created contradictions in women's lives. On the one hand, they enjoyed unusual freedoms, the ability to own property, to speak boldly, to oversee estates. On the other hand, their autonomy was constantly framed by the demands of reproduction and survival. A woman who failed to bear children might be marginalized, regardless of her wealth or competence. A woman who succeeded in producing heirs, especially sons, might wield great influence, but her influence always served the collective needs of Sparta. Marriage, childbirth, inheritance. These were not private matters in Sparta. They were woven tightly into the fabric of the state. The life of each woman was a thread in a larger pattern, designed not for her own comfort or fulfillment, but for the endurance of a society that demanded constant sacrifice. So when we imagine the life of a Spartan wife, it is not enough to picture her as a bold figure commanding helots or speaking sharply in public. We must also see her in the quiet hours of night, waiting for a husband who slips away from his barracks for a brief visit. We must picture her bent over an infant, uncertain if the child will survive. We must picture her reviewing property records, arranging marriages for her children, and negotiating disputes over inheritance. These were the ordinary but relentless responsibilities that defined her existence. But what did all of this mean for the survival of Sparta itself? How did the ceaseless labors of women, in marriage, childbirth, and household management, hold together a society that prided itself on the discipline of its men? And what happens when the burden placed upon women grows heavier than the system can bear? When we step back and look at the position of women in Sparta, it becomes clear that they formed the silent backbone of the state. For all the fame that Spartan warriors earned in battle, for all the laws and customs that exalted the discipline of men, it was women who quietly held together the fragile system. Their labor, their property, their endurance in childbirth, and their management of households were the glue that bound the society across generations. Without them, the Spartan ideal of the citizen soldier could not have survived even a few decades. The paradox of their lives lay in the way freedom and restriction intertwined. Compared to their counterparts in Athens, Corinth, or Thebes, Spartan women enjoyed unusual visibility and control. They owned property, they managed estates, and they spoke publicly with confidence. Foreign visitors often remarked with astonishment at the independence of Spartan women, describing them as bold, even shameless, because they appeared in public unescorted and engaged freely in conversation. These qualities stood in sharp contrast to the seclusion expected of women elsewhere in Greece. Yet this freedom was never entirely their own. It was granted, or rather imposed, by the peculiar structure of Spartan society. Because men were absent for so much of their lives, first in the agoge, then in barracks, then on campaign, women filled the vacuum. They had to manage land, oversee agricultural production, direct helot labor, and make decisions about households. Their freedom was less a deliberate concession of rights than a pragmatic necessity. The state required their involvement, because without it, the machinery of Spartan life would have collapsed. This pragmatic empowerment, however, came at a cost. Women were not celebrated as individuals, nor honored for their personal accomplishments. Their worth was measured in service, to the collective. A woman's strongest claim to honor was through motherhood. Those who bore many sons could boast of their contribution to Sparta's strength. Those who lost sons in battle were expected to accept the loss without complaint. Grief was tolerated only if it was stoic, never if it weakened resolve. The harsh saying, "with it or on it," attached to the handing over of a shield, embodies this expectation. Sons should either return victorious or die honorably. Mothers were cast as guardians of this uncompromising ethos. This expectation transformed private sorrow into public duty. For women, mourning was regulated, their voices shaped to echo the values of the state. The personal dimensions of motherhood, the tenderness, the affection, the grief, were filtered through the lens of civic obligation. Even the act of raising children was not simply about family continuity, but about reproducing citizens. Daughters were prepared to inherit and manage estates. Sons were hardened for the military. Every household became a training ground for the next generation of Spartan service. One of the most striking elements of this system is the way it concentrated wealth in women's hands. Because of frequent warfare and high male mortality, land often passed to daughters or widows. By the 4th century BCE, as writers like Aristotle noted with unease, women controlled a significant share of Spartan land. Some estimates suggest nearly 2/5. This concentration of wealth might suggest great female power, but it also destabilized the balance of Spartan society. The small citizen body, already shrinking due to low birth rates, became further divided between those families who held extensive estates and those who could not maintain their required contributions to the mess groups. This inequality contributed to the decline of Sparta. When too many men could not afford to sustain their citizenship obligations, the core of the citizen army weakened. The very system that relied on women to preserve estates also allowed property to accumulate in fewer hands, amplifying the pressures on an already fragile population. Women's role as managers of property, therefore, was both a support and an unintended undermining of the Spartan order. Another element of paradox is the relationship between women and the helots. Spartan women often supervised the agricultural work of enslaved helots, directing them in planting, harvesting, and managing livestock. This gave women direct control over labor and resources, but it also tied their fortunes to the continued subjugation of others. The relative comfort and freedom of Spartan wives was built, in part, on the toil and suffering of helots. This reality complicates any picture of female empowerment. The daily authority of women over enslaved labor was not liberation, but another form of control within a deeply stratified society. Yet for all these contradictions, women were indispensable. Without their vigilance, households would have faltered. Without their strength in childbirth, the citizen body would have dwindled even faster. Without their property management, estates would have dissolved into chaos. They sustained the Spartan system not because it offered them fulfillment, but because survival demanded it. The legacy of Spartan women has long fascinated observers. Some ancient writers admired their boldness. Others condemned their independence as unnatural. Modern historians debate whether their relative freedoms represent an early form of female empowerment or a grim example of instrumentalization. The truth lies somewhere in between. Spartan women were not pioneers of liberation, nor passive victims. They were participants in a system that used their strength for its own ends, granting them authority in some domains while binding them tightly to the needs of the state. Their story reminds us that freedom and power cannot be understood without context. To say that Spartan women were freer than Athenian women is true in some ways but misleading in others. They were free to own land, but not free from the expectation of reproduction. They were free to speak boldly, but not free to grieve openly. They were free to manage estates, but not free to reshape the system that demanded their service. As Sparta declined in the later classical period, the burdens on women grew heavier. With fewer men to marry, fewer citizens to bear children, and greater concentrations of property at stake, their responsibilities multiplied. At the same time, the strict ideals of the state became harder to uphold. Women found themselves managing estates without adequate labor, arranging marriages in a shrinking citizen pool, and enduring the consequences of a society stretched beyond its limits. In the end, the story of Spartan women is not one of triumph or tragedy, but of endurance. They endured the dangers of childbirth, the solitude of managing households alone, the grief of losing sons in battle, and the contradictions of a society that both elevated and constrained them. Their endurance kept Sparta alive far longer than it might otherwise have lasted. When we picture Sparta, we often think first of men in bronze armor, lined in formation, shields locked together. But behind that wall of shields stood women who trained children, managed estates, and bore the cost of survival. The city's reputation for discipline and strength rested in large part on their shoulders. So the next time you hear about the 300 at Thermopylae, or the endurance of Spartan warriors, pause to remember the quiet strength of their wives, mothers, and daughters. Without them, there would have been no Sparta to defend, no army to march, no legend to remember. And yet, one question lingers. Did these women truly hold power, or were they simply carrying the weight of a system that used them without ever allowing them to shape it? When we turn our attention from the polished bronze of Spartan warriors and the carefully managed households of Spartan women, we encounter the group that made all of it possible, the helots. Numbering far more than the citizens they served, these people tilled the fields, harvested crops, tended livestock, and supplied the resources that sustained the Spartan state. Without their labor, there would have been no time for men to train endlessly in the agoge or for women to concentrate on managing estates. The helots were the invisible foundation of Spartan society, and their story is one of subjugation, endurance, and unending vigilance against oppression. The term helot itself has a layered meaning. Some sources link it to the town of Helos in Laconia, suggesting that its people were among the first to be reduced to servitude by the Spartans in their early expansions. Others see it as a more general designation, a word that came to encompass various groups conquered and bound to Spartan lands. Whatever its origin, by the classical period the word had become synonymous with a particular form of servitude, harsher than serfdom, distinct from chattel slavery, and deeply embedded in the political system of Sparta. Unlike household slaves in Athens or Corinth, helots were not bought and sold as individuals in bustling markets. They were bound to the land, attached to estates in the territories of Laconia, and more importantly, Messenia. This attachment meant that when land passed from one Spartan owner to another, the helots who worked it went with it. Their lives were tied not to personal masters, but to the soil itself, ensuring that Spartan estates always came with the labor necessary to sustain them. The origins of helotage are rooted in conquest. Early in Spartan history, during the centuries after the Dorian migration, the Spartans expanded aggressively into knees, eye-boring regions. The most significant of these conquests was Messenia, a fertile territory to the west of Laconia. Beginning in the 8th century BCE, Sparta launched campaigns that gradually subdued the Messenians. These wars were long and bitter, stretching over generations, and when Sparta finally secured dominance, it transformed the defeated population into helots. Unlike the periodic enslavement of war captives in other Greek states, this was systematic and enduring. Entire communities were reduced, not just a portion of prisoners, and the status was hereditary. To be born a Messenian under Spartan rule was to be born a helot. This act of conquest reshaped the demography of the region. Suddenly, the Spartan citizen body, already small, found itself ruling over a population many times its size. Estimates vary, but some ancient sources suggest helots outnumbered citizens by as much as 7 to 1. Even if those numbers are exaggerated, the imbalance was profound. The Spartans lived in constant awareness of their minority position, a fact that shaped almost every aspect of their society, from military organization to social customs. The perpetual fear of revolt hung over them, and this fear justified, in their own eyes, the brutality with which they treated the helots. The legal status of helots was unusual, occupying a middle ground between slavery and freedom. They could not be sold abroad, as slaves in other Greek states might be, nor entirely stripped from the land they worked. They maintained family units, and some had limited rights to keep a portion of the produce they grew. In this sense, their existence resembled that of serfs in medieval Europe, bound to estates, enduring obligations of labor, yet never fully dispossessed of their connection to the land. But these limited allowances should not be mistaken for kindness. Helots lived under constant degradation. They were required to provide a fixed portion of their harvest to their Spartan overlords, often half or more of what they produced. They were subjected to humiliation rituals, forced, according to some accounts, to wear distinctive clothing, or made to endure mockery in public ceremonies meant to reinforce their inferior status. Their very existence was a daily reminder of Spartan domination, and their treatment reflected the deep anxiety Spartans felt about keeping such a large population in check. One chilling manifestation of this anxiety was the annual declaration of war against the helots. Each year, upon the taking of office, the Spartan ephors declared a ritual state of war on the helot population. This legal fiction permitted citizens to kill helots without incurring religious pollution or legal penalty. It institutionalized violence as a means of control, embedding it into the very fabric of Spartan governance. The message was clear. Helots were not merely laborers, but a subject population under permanent threat. To understand the everyday reality of helot life, we must imagine the seasonal rhythms of agriculture in Laconia and Messenia. In spring, helots plowed fields with oxen, sowed barley and wheat, and tended olive groves just beginning to bud. In summer, they weeded, watered, and maintained the vines that would yield grapes for wine. Harvest came in the autumn, a time of back-breaking labor, gathering grain under the watchful eyes of overseers, pressing olives into oil, and collecting grapes for fermentation. Winter brought tasks of maintenance, repairing tools, tending livestock, and preparing fields for the next cycle. These activities were not occasional duties, but relentless demands, repeated year after year. The yield of the harvest was no, but theirs to enjoy. Much of it was carted off to Spartan households or to supply the communal messes where citizens dined. The helots themselves subsisted on what remained: coarse barley porridge, beans, vegetables, and whatever small livestock they could keep. The rhythm of their lives was dictated not only by the seasons, but also by the quotas imposed upon them. Failure to meet obligations could mean punishment, confiscation, or worse. The brutality of their subjugation was not always visible in physical chains, but in the pervasive control of their labor and their lives. A helot might appear to live with a family, to work familiar fields, to see children grow, but all of it was shadowed by the knowledge that their effort existed for the enrichment of others. The endurance of such a system required extraordinary resilience. And yet, even within these confines, helots preserved elements of community and identity. Because they were not scattered individually but remained in large, rooted populations, they maintained cultural continuity. The Messenians, in particular, retained traditions, dialects, and shared memories of independence. These memories fueled resistance and rebellion, even if suppressed. The fact that Spartan authorities felt the need to declare annual war on them speaks to the persistence of helot identity and the constant threat it posed. The helots thus represent both the strength and the weakness of Sparta. Their labor provided the stability and resources that allowed Spartans to specialize as warriors, to live apart from the common burdens of agriculture, and to cultivate the rigid military discipline that became their hallmark. But their presence in such overwhelming numbers also represented a permanent danger, one that forced Sparta into harsh measures and distorted its society into perpetual readiness for internal conflict. As we leave this first look at the helots, the question lingers. What was it like to live every day, knowing that your toil sustained the very system that enslaved you, and that rebellion was both necessary and nearly impossible? How did a people so numerous remain bound for so long? And what forces eventually pushed them to resist? When we try to imagine the life of a helot, not in terms of conquest and status, but in terms of everyday rhythm, we must turn our attention to the land itself. The Laconian plain and the fertile valleys of Messenia were the stage upon which their days unfolded. Unlike the Spartans, who spoke endlessly of war, the helots' world was one of soil, water, seed, and harvest. Year after year, generation after generation, they labored to coax food from the earth, only to see much of it carried away to support the citizens who held them in subjugation. Agriculture in ancient Greece was a matter of necessity rather than choice. The Mediterranean climate, with its wet winters and long, dry summers, imposed a strict rhythm upon cultivation. For helots, this meant that their calendar was dictated by the needs of crops rather than the wishes of their families. In early autumn, as the parched fields finally received the first rains, it was time to prepare the soil. Helots walked behind oxen, guiding wooden plows tipped with bronze or iron, scratching furrows into the earth. The work was slow and exhausting, but essential. Grain, especially barley, the staple food, depended on this labor. Once the soil was turned, seeds were broadcast by hand, scattered in wide arcs across the furrows. Helots trudged up and down the fields, baskets slung over their shoulders, the grain falling in rhythmic handfuls. It was not only barley, but also wheat, lentils, and chickpeas. These legumes restored nutrients to the soil and provided variety in the diet, though much of it went not to helots themselves, but into the quotas they were required to deliver. The quotas were central to the relationship between Spartan citizens and the helot laborers bound to their estates. Each citizen was required to contribute a fixed portion of food to the syssitia, the communal mess where Spartan men ate together. Tea, whose portions included barley, wine, cheese, figs, and meat on certain occasions. A citizen could only maintain his place in the mess if he could meet these contributions, and the ability to do so depended entirely on the helots who worked his land. Thus the citizen's status as a full Spartan, a homoios, or equal, rested directly upon the reliability of helot production. This created a system of extraction in which helots bore the burden not only of their own survival, but also of their master's social standing. The expectation was that they delivered produce in kind, not in money. After harvest, wagons laden with sacks of barley or amphorae of oil made their way from helot farms to Spartan households or communal stores. The amounts were not trivial. Ancient commentators suggest that helots might be required to surrender as much as half of their yield. Even if this figure is exaggerated, it conveys the harshness of the demands. What remained was often meager, barely enough to sustain a family through the lean months of winter. The cycle of agricultural labor continued with olives and grapes, two of the most important crops in the Peloponnese. Olive groves dotted the hillsides, their gnarled trunks centuries old, requiring constant care. Helots pruned branches in winter, cleared undergrowth, and harvested the fruit in late autumn. The olives were shaken from the trees with long poles, gathered into baskets, and pressed for oil. The process was labor-intensive, and the product precious. Olive oil was not just food, but fuel for lamps, a base for perfumes, and a substance used in religious rituals. Once again, much of it flowed away from helot households to meet quotas or to enrich Spartan elites. Viticulture added another dimension. Vineyards demanded pruning, tying, and careful attention to growth. In summer, helots moved through rows of vines, trimming excess shoots and ensuring the plants bore healthy fruit. The harvest came in early autumn, when grapes were collected in woven baskets and brought to presses. Fermentation took place in clay jars, producing the wine that filled Spartan cups. This too was a communal necessity, a marker of status and a source of wealth. For helots, it was another set of tasks that bound them to the cycles of labor. Nor was their work confined to crops alone. Livestock played a crucial role. Helots tended sheep and goats, leading them to pasture, milking them, shearing wool, and guarding them against predators. They raised pigs, valuable for meat, and poultry, useful for eggs. Oxen were essential for ploughing, and their care demanded daily attention. These animals required feed, shelter, and vigilance, tasks that fell upon helot families. The products, wool, hides, meat, entered the Spartan economy as well, strengthening the dependency of citizens on helot labor. Seasonality structured everything. Spring demanded sowing and maintenance, summer required irrigation and vigilance against pests, autumn brought the exhausting work of harvest, and winter imposed tasks of storage and repair. In barns and granaries, helots stored grain in clay jars, sealed against moisture and pests, rationing carefully for the months ahead. They patched roofs, mended tools, and repaired fences. Even in seasons when fields lay fallow, there was no rest. The labor of survival was unending. One dimension often overlooked is the domestic labor that paralleled the agricultural. Helot women in particular bore the burden of food preparation, textile production, and child-rearing. They ground grain by hand on stone querns, a monotonous task that consumed hours each day. They baked bread in clay ovens, brewed beer or weaker fermented drinks, and prepared the simple meals that sustained families. They spun wool, wove cloth on upright looms, and produced garments for their households. This textile production was essential, for clothing wore out quickly under the demands of fieldwork. Children were trained early to contribute, carrying water from wells or helping to tend animals. The helot household was thus an economic unit, but one perpetually oriented toward meeting the demands of others. The burden of taxation in kind had social consequences, as well as economic ones. For Spartan citizens, it meant they could focus on military training and communal life, secure in the knowledge that helot labor provided their sustenance. For helots, it meant perpetual anxiety. Each harvest raised the same question: would the yield suffice to meet the quotas and still leave enough for their own families? A poor season, drought, blight, or pests could push them into desperation. The obligation did not diminish in bad years. Spartan citizens still expected their due. Thus, helots bore the full brunt of agricultural risk. This insecurity reinforced the precariousness of their existence. Even if they worked diligently, forces beyond their control, weather, disease, natural disaster, could imperil their ability to deliver. The penalties for shortfall were harsh. Helots might face beatings, confiscation of their meager stores, or worse. Some sources suggest that overseers humiliated or punished helots to remind them of their subjugation. These rituals of degradation were as much about maintaining control as about extracting labor. And yet, despite the harshness, the system endured for centuries. The reason lay in its structure. By binding helots to the land rather than dispersing them as individual slaves, Sparta ensured a stable, if oppressed, workforce. Helot families remained in place, cultivating the same fields their parents and grandparents had known. Their labor was predictable, their output regular. The Spartans relied on this predictability to sustain their rigid social system. Without it, the agoge, the communal messes, and the constant military readiness of citizens could not have been maintained. But stability was deceptive. Beneath the surface, resentment simmered. Helots remembered their independence, especially in Messenia, and passed down stories of freedom lost. They saw their labor enriching others, while their own families lived on the edge of subsistence. They endured humiliation rituals, exploitation, and the ever-present threat of violence. This tension never disappeared. It only waited for the right moment to erupt, as it would in rebellions that shook Sparta to its core. The daily life of the helot, then, was a paradox. It was monotonous in its repetition, tied to the unchanging cycles of agriculture, yet precarious in its insecurity, always shadowed by fear. It produced stability for Sparta, but also instability in the form of constant risk of revolt. It was at once ordinary, the tasks of ploughing, sowing, harvesting, and cooking, and extraordinary in the scale of exploitation. As we pause here, the question lingers. How did the Spartans maintain control over such a vast and resentful population for so long? And what measures did they employ to prevent rebellion from breaking into open war? The question of control always hung over Sparta. A society in which a tiny minority of citizens ruled over a population several times larger could not rely on consent. Instead, it relied on fear, ritual, and calculated brutality. The helots were not simply agricultural laborers. They were a population under constant surveillance, deliberately reminded of their subjugation. At the center of this system was an institution both enigmatic and chilling: the crypteia. The crypteia is one of the most discussed but least clearly defined practices in Spartan history. Ancient sources disagree on its nature, but all agree on its function: to instill terror in the helots. According to Plutarch, the crypteia involved selecting young Spartan men, often those who had distinguished themselves in training, and sending them into the countryside armed only with daggers and minimal provisions. By day they hid, by night they roamed. Their task was to kill helots, not in open battle, but secretly, through ambush and intimidation. Strong, capable helots, those most likely to resist, were targeted. The message was unmistakable. No helot was safe, not even in his own village. Whether the crypteia was a formal institution or a ritualized stage of training is debated. Some scholars argue that it functioned as a test of endurance and stealth for young Spartans, aligning with their militarized upbringing. Others emphasize its role as a systematic tool of oppression. What seems clear is that it served both purposes. For the Spartan youth, it was a grim initiation into the responsibilities of rule. For the helots, it was a constant reminder of vulnerability. This atmosphere of terror was reinforced annually through a striking ritual. Each year, according to Aristotle, the ephors, the senior magistrates of Sparta, declared war on the helots. This declaration had no connection to actual battles. Its purpose was legal. By declaring war, Spartans could kill helots without committing sacrilege. Normally, killing a fellow human being without cause was an act that polluted the community in the eyes of the gods. But if helots were designated enemies, their deaths were permitted. This legal fiction turned everyday murder into a sanctioned practice. The psychological effect was profound. For the helots, it meant that their lives were never secure. They were not simply subject to punishment for disobedience. They were subject to death at any moment, for no reason other than their status. For Spartans, it reinforced the notion that helots were not true members of the community, but perpetual outsiders, enemies living in their midst. This framing sustained the ideology of dominance that underpinned the entire social order. Surveillance was not limited to the crypteia. Spartan citizens, though few in number, were constantly alert to signs of unrest. Any gathering of helots could be interpreted as suspicious. Any sign of prosperity might be seen as threatening. Helots who appeared stronger, wealthier, or more independent than their peers risked being singled out. Some sources describe how helots were humiliated deliberately, forced to wear dogskin caps, or to drink excessive amounts of wine during festivals, paraded before Spartan youth as examples of shameful behavior. These rituals reinforced social boundaries and reminded both citizens and helots of the hierarchy. At the same time, the system was fragile. The sheer numerical superiority of the helots meant that, if united, they could overwhelm their masters. This was no abstract fear. Rebellions occurred, some large enough to threaten the existence of Sparta itself. The most significant were the Messenian revolts. The Messenians, conquered in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, never accepted their status passively. Their memory of independence was strong, and their numbers in Messenia far exceeded those of the Spartan settlers. Over time, resentment boiled over. The First Messenian War, late 8th century BCE, resulted in their initial subjugation. The Second Messenian War, mid-7th century BCE, was a full-scale revolt, in which helots fought fiercely to regain freedom. The poet Tyrtaeus, himself a Spartan, wrote verses urging citizens to stand firm against the rebels. Though the Spartans eventually crushed the uprising, it left a lasting scar. The memory of Messenian resistance haunted them, shaping their policies of control for generations. Another major rebellion came after the earthquake of 464 BCE. The tremors devastated Sparta, destroying houses and killing many citizens. Sensing weakness, the Messenian helots rose in revolt, joined by perioikoi, the free but non-citizen inhabitants of Laconia. The rebellion was not a mere disturbance, but a protracted conflict. The helots fortified themselves on Mount Ithome in Messenia, and the war dragged on for nearly a decade. Sparta, for all its military reputation, struggled to put down the insurgency and even called upon allies, including Athens, for assistance. The eventual suppression did not erase the memory. It reinforced the Spartans' perpetual fear that their system rested on unstable foundations. What was life like for helots during such periods of unrest? For many, rebellion meant upheaval. Families might be torn apart, villages destroyed, crops neglected. Those who joined the insurgents risked everything, but so did those who stayed behind. Spartans punished suspected sympathizers harshly, ensuring that no helot could feel secure. Yet rebellion also offered a glimpse of possibility, the hope that subjugation was not eternal, that freedom could be reclaimed. Even failed uprisings sustained this hope, passing it on to future generations. Between rebellions, daily life resumed its agricultural routine, but the presence of surveillance and the memory of punishment lingered. The helots' field was not just a place of labor, but a space of danger. At any moment, a Spartan youth might emerge from hiding, dagger in hand. At any moment, a small act of defiance might draw suspicion. The monotony of farming was shadowed by the unpredictability of violence. This interplay between routine and terror defined the helot experience. On one hand, their lives were filled with the same tasks that peasants across the ancient Mediterranean performed: ploughing, sowing, tending animals, raising children. On the other, those tasks were carried out under a system uniquely structured to deny security. The very ordinariness of helot life was distorted by the constant threat of interruption, humiliation, or death. The Spartans' reliance on fear had consequences for their own society as well. To maintain dominance, they had to remain perpetually vigilant. This vigilance shaped their institutions, their training, and their world-view. The agoge was not only preparation for war against external enemies, but also a means of ensuring that every citizen was ready to suppress internal revolt. Spartan austerity, discipline, and constant readiness were responses not only to the Persians or the Athenians, but to the helots living just beyond their doorsteps. In this sense, the helots defined Sparta as much as the Spartans defined the helots. The ruling class constructed its identity in opposition to those it enslaved. Without helots, there could have been no full-time warrior elite, no communal messes, no singular focus on military training. But with helots came fear, and with fear came the rituals of domination that, to make Spartan society so unusual in the Greek world, the paradox deepens when we consider the perspectives of outsiders. Other Greek states viewed Sparta with a mix of admiration and suspicion. They marveled at its discipline, its military prowess, and the austerity of its citizens. Yet they also recognized that this way of life rested upon the backs of an oppressed majority. The helots were both invisible and ever-present in these accounts, acknowledged as essential but rarely granted individuality. For the Spartans, this was deliberate. To name the helot was to humanize them. To reduce them to a faceless mass was to maintain control. But beneath this anonymity lay countless individual stories. Families who planted crops together, children who grew up under the shadow of oppression, elders who remembered freedom long lost. These stories are not preserved in the historical record, but they can be imagined through the fragments that survive. They remind us that the helots were not an abstract class, but people living complex lives, enduring monotony and terror in equal measure. And so we return to the central question. How long could such a system endure? Could fear alone sustain a society indefinitely, or did it sow the seeds of its own destruction? The rebellions suggest that resistance was never fully extinguished, only suppressed. The surveillance system, for all its brutality, could never entirely eliminate the desire for freedom. As we leave this section, consider the silence of the fields at night, when helot families gathered in their huts, uncertain if the knock at the door would come. Consider the shadows moving across the landscape. Were they neighbors returning late, or members of the crypteia stalking their prey? The ordinary sounds of the countryside, a dog barking, a branch snapping, a cart creaking, carried an added weight. Life continued, but always under the question, what would tomorrow bring? When we step back from the details of surveillance, agricultural labor, and rebellion, the helot system emerges not merely as a feature of Spartan life, but as its defining foundation. To understand why Sparta was unlike any other Greek polis, we must understand how the helots sustained and constrained it. Without their coerced labor, the rigid militarization of Spartan society could not have existed. But because of their presence, Sparta was also trapped in a cycle of fear and vigilance, unable to pursue the paths of development chosen by other city-states. At its core, the helot system was a solution to a problem of resources. The Eurotas Valley, where Sparta lay, was fertile compared to much of Greece, but not boundless. The conquest of Messenia in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE expanded Spartan territory dramatically, giving them control of rich plains and valleys. But conquest alone could not feed the Spartan state. To maintain a warrior elite unburdened by farming, someone else had to work the land. The helots became that someone. This arrangement allowed Sparta to become what many Greeks described as a camp in perpetuity, a state organized as if it were on permanent military footing. Male citizens could dedicate themselves entirely to the agoge, to training, to communal dining in the Syssitia, to serving in the army. Freed from the ordinary concerns of tilling fields and tending herds, they embodied the ideal of the professional hoplite. The cost of this freedom, however, was borne by the helots. The system had consequences far beyond economics. Culturally, it shaped Spartan values. Where Athenians praised rhetoric, innovation, and the arts, Spartans emphasized discipline, obedience, and endurance. This was not merely preference, but necessity. A society that lived surrounded by a hostile majority could not afford indulgence or luxury. Every Spartan's Itizen was, in a sense, a soldier, not only against foreign enemies, but against the possibility of internal revolt. This tension influenced foreign policy as well. Sparta was famously cautious in its military commitments. While Athens sent fleets across the Aegean and experimented with empire, Sparta hesitated to campaign far from home. The reason was simple. If too many hoplites marched abroad, the helots might rise at home. Even during the Persian Wars, Sparta delayed sending aid to Thermopylae and Plataea until it felt secure enough about its own population. The earthquake of 464 BCE and the subsequent revolt only deepened this caution, reminding Sparta that its greatest threat might lie within its own borders. In effect, the helots both enabled and limited Spartan power. They gave Sparta the resources to sustain a uniquely militarized citizenry, But they also chained that citizenry to constant vigilance, preventing the kind of outward expansion that might have transformed Sparta into a lasting empire. It is worth pausing to consider how unusual this arrangement was in the wider Greek world. Other city-states also relied on dependent labor, but rarely on the same scale or under the same conditions. Athens had slaves, often captured in war or purchased through trade. But these individuals were outsiders with no collective identity. They came from diverse backgrounds and spoke different languages, which reduced the likelihood of coordinated rebellion. By contrast, the helots were a single people, conquered and enslaved in their homeland, bound together by shared culture and memory. Their numbers were vast, and their unity made them a permanent danger. This danger was never fully resolved. Rebellions could be suppressed, but resentment endured. The rituals of humiliation and terror were not simply expressions of cruelty. They were desperate attempts to manage an unmanageable reality. The Spartans knew that their control rested on fragile ground. They could never forget it, because the helots never allowed them to. From a modern perspective, the helot system also challenges the popular image of Sparta as a society of equality and austerity. It is true that Spartan citizens lived simply, dining together in common messes and sharing in the hardships of training. But this equality existed only within the citizen body, a small minority of the population. The abundance that allowed citizens to scorn wealth and luxury came directly from the labor of the helots. Without helots delivering crops and tending fields, Spartan citizens could not have pretended to disdain material comforts. The simplicity of Spartan life was not an escape from wealth, but a redistribution of wealth's burdens onto others. The paradox is sharp. The society most famous for its warriors was also one of the most dependent on others to fight its daily battles for survival, the battles of sowing, harvesting, and feeding. The strength of Sparta was inseparable from the weakness imposed upon the helots. We can trace the long-term consequences of this system in Sparta's decline. During the Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BCE, Sparta's discipline and military reputation enabled it to outlast Athens and eventually emerge as the leading power in Greece. Yet this dominance was short-lived. Almost immediately, the burdens of maintaining control over helots strained Spartan resources. Victories abroad required garrisons and prolonged campaigns, but each absence heightened the risk of rebellion at home. By the early 4th century BCE, the cracks were widening. In 371 BCE, Sparta suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Leuctra against Thebes. This battle did more than shatter the myth of Spartan invincibility. It also opened the way for Theban forces under Epaminondas to invade the Peloponnese and liberate Messenia. For the first time in centuries, the Messenians regained independence. Sparta lost not only territory but also the agricultural base that sustained its warrior class. The consequences were immediate and irreversible. Stripped of its helot labor force, Sparta could no longer maintain the same citizen body or military system. The foundations of its society crumbled. This turning point underscores the centrality of the helot system. It was not merely an economic arrangement, but the very scaffolding of Spartan power. Once removed, the edifice collapsed. Sparta remained a city, and its people continued to live in the Eurotas Valley, but it never again dominated Greece as it had in the 5th century BCE. Reflecting on the helots also deepens our understanding of ancient slavery more broadly. Too often, historical narratives focus on the elites, the generals, the politicians, the citizens who debated in assemblies and fought in battles. Yet these stories rest upon the invisible labor of those who worked the fields, cooked the meals, and bore the burdens. In Sparta, the helots were not entirely invisible. They were acknowledged in sources precisely because their presence was impossible to ignore. But even here, their voices are absent. We hear of them only through the words of their masters or their enemies. And yet by piecing together these fragments, we glimpse their endurance. We see them laboring year after year, providing the harvests that sustained one of the most unusual societies in history. We see them seizing opportunities for resistance, whether in open rebellion or in smaller acts of defiance. We see them shaping the destiny of Sparta, not by choice, but by necessity. Their legacy, then, is double. On one hand, they remind us of the costs of Sparta's military ideal, the human suffering that underpinned the legend. On the other, they remind us of the resilience of those who live under oppression, who endure monotony and terror, yet continue to sustain life and sea. Hiatus, immunity. As we close this story, imagine again the fields of Laconia and Messenia. The soil is dark and fertile, the olive groves stretching out under the sun, the rivers flowing steadily. These landscapes, so central to the daily rhythms of the helots, are the quiet foundation of history. Without them, there could have been no hoplite ranks at Thermopylae, no stern discipline that fascinated and alarmed other Greeks. Behind every Spartan shield, there was a helot's hand at the plough. Behind every communal mess, there was a basket of grain harvested under duress. Sparta's legacy is inseparable from theirs. To remember the Spartans without remembering the helots is to see only half the picture. It is to accept the legend without recognizing the labor that sustained it. And perhaps that is the final lesson, that societies built on coercion and fear may achieve power, but they cannot escape dependence on those they seek to suppress. In the end, it was the liberation of the helots, not the defeat of Spartan armies, that brought an end to Sparta's dominance. The helots endured, and in their endurance, they shaped history. When people today hear the word Sparta, they often think first of warriors. The image of the Spartan hoplite, helmet gleaming, shield raised, spear poised, has become one of the most enduring symbols of antiquity. But behind this image lies a quieter, more complicated reality. The war machine of Sparta was not simply a matter of bravery and discipline. It was a system built from the ground up, sustained by resources, training, logistics, and habits that were as monotonous as they were essential. Let's begin with the equipment, because without armor and weapons, there could be no Spartan warrior. A hoplite's gear was both a burden and a badge of identity. The central piece was the aspis, often called the hoplon, a round shield roughly 3 feet in diameter, made of wood faced with bronze. It was heavy, around 15 pounds, and carried on the left arm by means of a central grip and a leather strap. This shield was not just protection. It was the key to the phalanx formation. Each man's shield overlapped with his neighbor's, creating a wall of bronze and wood that advanced as a single body. To lose one's shield was not only a tactical failure, but a disgrace, for it meant breaking the cohesion of the group. The famous Spartan mother's admonition to return with it or on it was more than a saying. It was a reminder that the community's survival depended on each shield being carried home. The rest of the hoplite's panoply was no less significant. Bronze greaves protected the shins, though some Spartans may have chosen lighter gear as time went on. The cuirass, originally made of solid bronze, evolved into composite constructions with layers of linen or leather reinforced with metal. These adjustments made it somewhat easier to wear during long marches under the Mediterranean sun. The helmet, with its crested plume, restricted vision and muffled hearing, but it projected an image of stern unity. Underneath, the warrior wore a simple tunic, often dyed red in Sparta's case, not for intimidation, as later legend sometimes suggests, but likely because the color concealed stains and preserved a sense of uniformity. The weapons, too, were standardized. The dory, a spear of about 7 to 9 feet, tipped with an iron head and counterweighted with a bronze butt spike. The sword, the xiphus, was a short weapon used only when the spear broke or in the crush of melee. It was functional, but secondary. The spear was the true weapon of the hoplite, and much of Spartan training revolved around wielding it in disciplined coordination. Equipping a hoplite was not cheap. Scholars estimate the cost of a full panoply to be the equivalent of several months or even years' wages for an ordinary Greek laborer. This meant that only those with sufficient means could fight in the phalanx. In Sparta, Where the citizen body was small and tightly regulated, the state ensured that full citizens had access to the necessary equipment. Yet this meant constant repair and replacement. Bronze tarnished, leather straps frayed, iron spearheads dulled. Keeping gear in working order was as important as training itself. Here we glimpse a side of Spartan life often overlooked: the maintenance of war materials. Imagine the long evenings spent polishing bronze until it gleamed, the quiet labor of sharpening spearheads on whetstones, the retying of straps, the inspection of shields for cracks. These were tasks neither glamorous nor optional. The effectiveness of the Spartan war machine rested on the dull repetition of upkeep. Beyond equipment, there was the question of training. The agoge prepared Spartans from childhood, but training did not end with adolescence. Adults drilled regularly, practicing formation maneuvers, learning to advance in rhythm, to hold lines steady, to respond to commands quickly. Much of this was tedious. Marching in step, aligning shields, rehearsing pivot maneuvers, these were exercises in discipline more than in individual skill. The phalanx demanded unity, and unity could only come from endless repetition. The training ground echoed with the sound of feet striking earth, shields clattering in practice, spears thudding against dummies, or striking air in coordinated thrusts. There were no dazzling displays of swordsmanship, no duels to impress onlookers. Instead, there was the patient drilling of men who understood that their survival depended on moving as one. This emphasis on group cohesion distinguished Sparta from many of its rivals. In Athens or Thebes, hoplites also fought in phalanxes, but the level of state-enforced training was less rigorous. Spartan citizens were molded from youth into instruments of the collective, and this discipline was recognized, and often feared, across Greece. But again, discipline was not born from inspiration. It was born from routine, from the unending cycles of drill that consumed Spartan lives. Then came the logistics of campaigning. Hoplites did not simply appear on battlefields. They marched there, carrying supplies, accompanied by attendants. Each Spartan hoplite was supported by helots who bore baggage, cooked meals, and tended to the daily needs of the soldiers. Without this support, campaigns could not have lasted more than a few days. Grain, cheese, olives, dried figs, and wine were standard provisions. Meat was rare except when livestock could be slaughtered from the baggage train. Marching was an ordeal in itself. Imagine a column of men, bronze gleaming under the sun, shields slung over shoulders, spears carried upright, feet raising dust with each step. The summer heat baked the earth, and water had to be secured from wells or streams along the way. At night, camps were established in ordered rows, with guards posted, fires lit, and meals prepared. It was not glamorous. It was the steady rhythm of moving an army across the landscape, dependent on terrain, weather, and the willingness of local communities to provide food. Even this depended on careful organization. Supply lines had to be secured. If the army marched too far without access to resources, it risked hunger. Campaign seasons were dictated by agriculture. Armies moved most often after harvest, when grain was available, and returned before winter. Thus, the war machine was tied intimately to the cycles of the land. One must also consider the psychological burden of this system. For Spartan men, military service was not a matter of choice, but of identity. From the age of 7, they were raised for it. From adulthood, they lived it. Campaigns were not rare adventures, but expected duties, recurring as long as their bodies allowed. The monotony of drills, the weight of armor, the endless attention to detail, all of this pressed down year after year. And yet this monotony created the reputation that made Sparta both respected and feared. To outsiders, Spartans seemed fearless, unshakable, always prepared. But behind that reputation was the quiet persistence of countless tasks: repairing, drilling, marching, enduring. It was not glory that sustained them, but discipline imposed from childhood, reinforced by necessity, and repeated until it became second nature. So, when you picture the Spartan war machine, do not imagine only the clash of spears at Thermopylae or the moment of triumph at Plataea. Imagine instead the campfires burning in the countryside, the helots carrying bundles of provisions, the warriors kneeling to polish their shields in the fading light. Imagine the long, dusty roads of the Peloponnese, the smell of sweat and bronze, the sound of men practicing the same step for the 100th time. The strength of Sparta lay not in sudden brilliance, but in steady preparation. And yet, even this preparation had limits. The very system that produced the Spartan war machine also bound it. Spartans could not campaign far without risking unrest at home. They could not adapt easily to changing military realities because their entire society was committed to the hoplite model. When faced with new threats and tactics, their rigidity became a weakness. But that is a story for later. For now, we leave the Spartans in their armor, standing in formation, shields locked, spears steady. They are ready to march. But the question remains: how would this war machine perform once it met the shifting realities of Greek warfare beyond the training ground? When the order came to march, the reality of war began not with battle, but with preparation. For a Spartan hoplite, campaign season was not a rare event, but a recurring duty. The rhythms of military life were as much about walking, waiting, and eating as they were about fighting. And so, if you picture yourself among them, you would not begin with a clash of bronze against bronze. You would begin with packing, lining up, and walking into the distance. The first task was always supplies. A hoplite could not carry everything he needed, and so the helots who accompanied each Spartan took on much of the load. These attendants bore sacks of grain, amphorae of wine, bundles of dried figs, and the tools required for cooking. The soldiers themselves carried their weapons, armor, and minimal personal items. Imagine the creak of leather straps under weight, the dull thud of baggage against backs, the uneven pace of men and animals setting out together. The road itself dictated progress. Some days it wound across stony ridges where sandals slipped, other days it cut through valleys where dust clung to skin. Always there was the sun, burning steadily through the long marches of summer. Food dictated much of the experience of campaign life. Spartan rations were simple: coarse barley bread, cheese, olives, onions, dried figs, and wine diluted with water. Meat was consumed when livestock could be slaughtered, but this was occasional rather than regular. Soldiers often ground grain into porridge or baked it into flat cakes at camp. The helots cooked these meals, tending small fires, stirring pots, dividing portions. Eating was not a moment of indulgence, but of necessity, taken in groups with little variety. Hunger was a constant companion, and the memory of home meals, such as the infamous black broth served in communal messes, was almost a comfort compared to the monotony of camas. Pain fare. Water was even more critical. Armies moved along routes where wells, rivers, or cisterns could be found. Thirst could undo a campaign faster than any enemy. The discipline of the Spartans meant they rationed carefully, but this too was wearying. Picture the line of men arriving at a stream, kneeling to refill skins, dust rising from their clothes as they crouched in the heat. The helots filled larger containers, ensuring that water was carried forward, even as the army pressed on. Camp life had its own routines. At the end of a day's march, the army settled into order. Tents were scarce. Most Spartans slept under the open sky, sometimes with only a cloak as covering. Fires were built in clusters, smoke rising in thin spirals. Guards were posted on the perimeter, chosen by lot or rotation, pacing through the night to watch for threats. The helots cooked the evening meal, distributing portions, while hoplites sat in groups, polishing weapons, adjusting straps, or speaking quietly. The sound of crackling fire mixed with the murmur of voices, the occasional laugh, and the steady scraping of whetstones on metal. Even sleep was disciplined. Men lay in formation, their shields and spears near at hand. At dawn, the army rose together, kindled new fires, boiled water for grain, and prepared to march again. It was a rhythm that stretched for days, sometimes weeks, before an enemy was even sighted. The campaign was often more about waiting than fighting. We must also consider the strain of these marches. Bronze armor was heavy, weighing perhaps 50 to 70 pounds in total when combined with weapons and shield. Though much of this was not carried directly on long marches, helots bore some of it. The physical burden remained real. Shoulders ached under the weight of shields, feet blistered in sandals worn thin by rocky ground, and backs stiffened after hours of marching. Sweat-soaked tunics, salt crystallizing on skin, and dust clung to every surface. And yet the discipline of the Spartans turned these hardships into routine. They had trained for endurance since childhood, accustomed to hunger, fatigue, and discomfort. What for others might have broken morale became for them an expected part of service. Still, even Spartans were human, and fatigue gnawed at them. Quiet moments on the march revealed men limping, leaning on spears for support, or shifting burdens uneasily. The stoicism of the Spartans was maintained outwardly, but within, each man bore the same aches as any other soldier. Supply chains extended beyond the army itself. Sparta depended on its helots and allies to provide grain and resources. During extended campaigns, provisions had to be brought in by wagon or ship. The Peloponnesian War made this painfully clear. Spartan armies operating far from home needed reliable lines of supply, and the disruption of these lines could cripple them. Food spoiled, wagons broke, animals sickened. Every campaign was a balancing act between distance, time, and resources. Seasonality shaped everything. Campaigns usually began after harvest, when grain could be collected and stored. Armies avoided winter, when rain turned roads to mud and rivers swelled. Summer heat posed its own dangers, but it was manageable compared to the cold and storms of winter. Thus, the rhythm of war followed the rhythm of agriculture. A Spartan hoplite might measure his military service not by the battles he fought, but by the harvests that had passed between them. And what of battle itself? Strikingly, most campaigns did not end in dramatic clashes. Armies maneuvered, threatened, and negotiated. Opponents might stare at each other across fields for days before withdrawing. Even when battle came, it was often brief, a few hours of chaos after weeks of preparation. For the hoplite, this meant much of his military life was waiting, not sting. The grand images of bronze lines colliding concealed the tedium of endless days of marching, eating the same porridge, and standing in formation under the sun. During these pauses, morale mattered. Spartans relied on ritual to sustain them. Sacrifices to the gods before battle, communal songs sung in rhythm, dances performed in camp. Music accompanied the march, flutes keeping time for the phalanx as it advanced. These sounds broke the monotony, giving order and meaning to the long stretches of waiting. But they also reinforced the collective. Each song was a reminder that the individual was nothing without the group. If you stood among the Spartans on campaign, you would notice the contrast between them and their helots. While Spartans drilled, cleaned armor, or sang hymns, helots moved quietly in the background, tending fires, fetching water, carrying loads. They bore the weight of the campaign, yet their presence was precarious. Spartans distrusted them, fearing revolt even in the field. The Krypteia, the secret police system at home, reminded all helots of their subjugated status. On campaign, that tension lingered. Every meal they prepared, every burden they carried, was marked by the knowledge that they served under compulsion. And then there was the ever-present uncertainty. No matter how well supplied, how disciplined, or how experienced, the army could not escape the unpredictability of weather, terrain, or enemy action. A sudden storm might drench supplies, rendering grain useless. A river might flood, delaying progress. A hostile village might refuse provisions, forcing a detour. Each setback tested patience and discipline. Spartans prided themselves on endurance, but endurance could not conjure food where there was none, nor dry grain once it was soaked. The cracks in the system were always visible, if one looked closely enough. So, When you imagine the Spartan army on campaign, set aside the heroic clash of spears for a moment. Picture instead the long line of men trudging across dusty roads, helots bent under loads, fires flickering at night as grain porridge simmers. Hear the scrape of whetstones, the low murmur of hymns, the creak of leather straps. Smell the sweat, the dust, the faint tang of bronze. This was the reality that sustained Sparta's reputation, a reputation born less of glorious charges and more of the steady endurance of men and the unseen labor of those who served them. But endurance had its limits. As campaigns stretched longer, as distances grew greater, and as enemies learned new tactics, could this war machine adapt? Or was it bound too tightly to its routines, too dependent on its helots, too rigid in its methods to change? That question remained, waiting to be answered on the fields where Spartans would face not just other hoplites, but new and evolving forms of warfare. When armies finally closed in upon one another, the rhythm of waiting shifted into something sharper. Yet even in the moments before battle, the experience of a Spartan hoplite was less about sudden drama and more about ritual, preparation, and discipline. Battles were rare compared to the long days of marching, and each one was preceded by hours, sometimes days, of hesitation. Thermopylae in 480 BCE, perhaps the most famous Spartan stand, was in fact days of endurance before hours of combat. If you were there, the narrow pass smelled of salt and damp earth, the cliffs pressing close on one side and the sea swelling on the other. Spartan soldiers, only a few thousand when counting their allies, waited as tens of thousands of Persian troops approached. But daily life did not stop. Fire still had to be lit, rations divided, weapons inspected. Spears splintered during drills and had to be repaired. Armor straps broke and were replaced. And the helots, as always, moved silently among them, tending burdens even under the gaze of enemies. The waiting was heavy. At dawn, smoke lifted into the pale light, and men chewed their barley bread with dry mouths. At dusk, they sat in groups, polishing armor by firelight, listening to the faint crash of waves. Fear was present, but Spartans had trained themselves to cover it with routine. They sang hymns, danced war dances, and sacrificed to the gods. Each ritual smoothed the nerves, turning anxiety into steady rhythm. And then the Persians came. Imagine the sound: drums beating, feet trampling, the hum of tens of thousands. Against this, the Spartans stood in silence, shields braced, spears angled forward. Hoplite warfare depended on formation, and at Thermopylae, the narrow pass forced the Persians into manageable lines. For hours, the clash was not one of individual heroism, but of group endurance. Spears jabbed, shields pressed. Men shoved against one another until bodies fell. Dust rose, sweat soaked tunics, and the air filled with the metallic tang of blood. For the Spartan in formation, vision was limited. The bronze helmet cut off the periphery, leaving only the back of the comrade ahead. Breathing was labored through the small opening, hot air collecting inside. The weight of the shield pressed into the shoulder, while the push of men behind drove the body forward. Combat was not a graceful duel, but a grind. Stabbing where openings appeared, bracing against surges, holding the line. Feet slipped on blood-slick stones, armor rang with blows, and the din was constant. Hours felt like days, and yet the battle could turn within moments when lines faltered. Thermopylae ended in death for the Spartans, but their endurance became legend. What is often forgotten is the exhaustion, the hunger, and the suffocating press of men that filled those days. Glory was remembered. The reality was left unsaid. Other battles told similar stories. Plataea, fought a year later in 479 BCE, was in many ways the opposite. A field wide and open, armies spread across plains, maneuvers lasting days before a clash. For the Spartans, it meant waiting again, waiting under the hot sun, rationing water from streams, keeping lines steady while rumors spread of Persian cavalry harassing flanks. Men stood with shields braced, spears at the ready, but for hours nothing happened. Dust rose, nerves frayed, Commanders argued. Hunger gnawed as supplies grew thin. When battle did come, it was sudden, chaotic, and brief. Hoplites advanced in lines, shields overlapping, spears thrusting forward. The Spartan discipline held, but the same grinding reality emerged. Armor grew heavy, sweat poured, lungs burned, ears filled with the clang of bronze and the shouts of comrades. A hoplite might not even see the man he killed, only feel the jolt of a spear thrust, hear the cry, and press forward again. The mind narrowed to rhythm. Step, thrust, brace. Behind, the helots shouted encouragement, carried water, or dragged away wounded. They too bore the strain of battle, though their names rarely entered the record. Plataea ended in Spartan victory. But again, what was celebrated afterward was not what was endured. The long days of waiting, the thirst, the sore feet, and the endless drills made up most of the experience. The clash itself, though decisive, was only a small fragment of what it meant to be there. By the time of the Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BCE, battle had changed. Sparta fought not only Athens but also the realities of prolonged conflict. Campaigns dragged on for years, with sieges, naval battles and raids supplementing the traditional hoplite clash. For the Spartan hoplite, this meant even more waiting, more marching, more dependence on supply chains. Sieges were particularly dull. Armies ringed a city, cutting it off, but days passed with little to do beyond maintaining watch, patrolling, and rationing supplies. Fires smoldered outside city walls, while inside defenders waited just as tensely. Disease spread in camps, boredom gnawed at discipline, and men whispered of home. The helots worked harder than ever, fetching wood, carrying water, and tending to livestock seized from surrounding farms. For months at a time, no battle came. The Spartans' reputation for discipline was tested in these long stretches, where courage it meant not a single stand but endurance of monotony. Naval campaigns were even less familiar to Spartans, who were land-based warriors by tradition. When Sparta eventually built fleets with Persian support, hoplites found themselves serving on ships, crammed onto triremes, rowing in unison, or standing ready to board. Seasickness, cramped conditions, and salt air replaced the dust and sweat of land marches. Though victories came, such as at Agoge, the daily life of the soldier was again more about labor than glory. The reality of combat, then, was layered. The decisive moments were brief, a few hours of terror, sweat and blood. But these moments were supported by weeks, even months, of preparation, marching, and waiting. For every tale of heroism, there were countless hours of standing in formation under the sun, countless bowls of porridge eaten in silence, countless nights of fitful sleep on stony ground. And the toll was not only physical, but psychological. Spartans were trained from childhood to accept discomfort, to suppress fear, and to embrace discipline. Yet fear could not be banished entirely. In the quiet before battle, hearts beat faster, mouths dried, and thoughts turned to home. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the endurance of it, the willingness to stand in line shoulder to shoulder, despite every instinct to flee. That, more than any single victory, was the essence of Spartan warfare. If you close your eyes and imagine yourself in their place, you would feel the sweat trickling beneath your helmet, the dull ache in your arm from holding the shield, the sharp sting of blisters in your sandals. You would hear the flute piping rhythm as the phalanx advanced, the crash of shield against shield, the cry of men pressed together. And when it ended, you would be left with silence, bodies on the ground, armor dented, dust settling. Victory or defeat, the routine resumed, rations to distribute, wounds to bind, watch to be kept. Life went on because it had to. The Spartans earned their reputation through this relentless cycle of endurance. But by the time of the Peloponnesian War, one could ask, how long could such discipline sustain them? Could a system built on rigidity adapt to the changing nature of warfare? To naval battles, sieges, and shifting alliances? Or was it already straining at its limits, showing cracks that no amount of training could conceal? The long story of Sparta was, in many ways, a story of endurance. Its people endured hunger, rigid discipline, constant war readiness, and the suspicion of neighbors and subjects alike. Yet even systems built on endurance eventually reached their limits. By the 4th century BCE, cracks in the Spartan world were visible. And if you were to stand within their society then, you would see not only the strains of warfare, but also the slow collapse of the rigid order that had once held them together. At first glance, Sparta seemed powerful even after its great wars. The defeat of Athens in 404 BCE had left the Spartans at the top of the Greek world, their warriors feared, their discipline admired. But daily life for ordinary Spartans remained as austere as ever. Meals in the Syssitia continued to be plain. Houses remained simple, with no painted walls or elaborate decorations. The same training ground echoes carried the voices of boys drilled from dawn until dusk. Nothing appeared to change. Yet beneath the surface, something was shifting. The number of full Spartan citizens, the Spartiates, was declining. War had taken its toll, but so too had the strict rules of inheritance and citizenship. To be considered a full citizen, one had to own land sufficient to support contributions to the mess halls. As wealth grew unevenly distributed, many Spartans fell below the requirement and were excluded from citizenship. By the 4th century, what had once been a community of equals was shrinking. Only a fraction of men remained full citizens, and the rigid system that had once bound them began to feel fragile. Meanwhile, the helots, always the majority, remained restless. Rebellions, though suppressed, had to be watched for constantly. The Cryptia still hunted in the night, but the fear of uprising weighed heavily. Each harvest season, Spartans depended on the labor of people, who hated them, and the tension never vanished. For the helot, little had changed. Long days in the fields, grain tallies owed to masters, the ever-present danger of sudden violence. For the Spartiate, however, the unease grew. How long could such domination last? Externally, Sparta's supremacy was tested almost immediately. Former allies in the Peloponnesian League grew resentful. Athens recovered faster than expected. Thebes rose in power, and Sparta, despite its reputation, was stretched thin. It lacked a large citizen body. It relied on reluctant allies, and it had little naval strength of its own. The rigidity that once made Sparta strong began to work against it. Adapting to new forms of warfare, new diplomacy, or new economic systems proved difficult. The decisive blow came at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE. There, Theban forces under Epaminondas defeated the Spartan army with a tactical innovation, stacking one wing of their phalanx deep and striking at the Spartan elite directly. The result was devastating. Hundreds of full Spartan citizens were killed in a single day, a loss that could not easily be replaced in a society where every soldier had been trained since boyhood. The myth of Spartan invincibility shattered. In the years that followed, Sparta never fully recovered. The Thebans invaded the Peloponnese, liberated the helots of Messenia, and carved out a new independent state that deprived Sparta of its agricultural backbone. Imagine, if you will, the shock within Spartan society. Fields once worked by helots no longer produced grain for the mess halls, and rations shrank. Without helot labor, the carefully balanced system unraveled. Spartans had long depended on others to sustain their austere life, and when that foundation crumbled, they had little left. Daily life grew even more strained. With fewer citizens, the burden on each remaining man grew heavier. Discipline became harder to maintain when the community shrank. The once proud Syssitia dwindled in number, and the songs that echoed in their halls grew quieter. The training of boys continued, but there were fewer boys to train. What had once been a formidable machine of endurance now creaked under its own weight. By the time Macedon rose under Philip II and Alexander the Great, Sparta was no longer a decisive power. It resisted incorporation, maintaining independence in name, but its influence had faded. In later centuries, under Roman rule, Sparta was remembered more as a curiosity than a force, a place where tourists could watch staged reenactments of the old training, a living museum of a way of life that no longer mattered. And so, when we look back at Sparta, what remains? For many, the word conjures images of warriors standing bravely at Thermopylae, shields locked, faces stern beneath bronze helmets. The legend endures because it is simple, clear, and dramatic. But the reality was never so clean. To live as a Spartan was to live within a system that demanded much and offered little. Endless discipline, monotonous meals, constant drills, rigid rules, and the burden of fear. Fear of enemies abroad, fear of rebellion at home, fear of falling short of the ideal. The glory was fleeting. The hardship was daily. To be a Spartan was not to live in triumph but in tension, in constant preparation for a danger that never truly went away. Even their victories sowed seeds of decline, as the very discipline that made them strong prevented them from adapting to change. For the helots, the system was even harsher. Toil without reward, subjugation without end, and the knowledge that their labor sustained the very people who oppressed them. For Spartan women, independ.
Ents came not from choice but from necessity, because the men were always away, fighting wars or drilling for the next one. For children, childhood was short, replaced by years of training, hunger, and harsh correction. For men, adulthood meant more of the same, carried to the end of life. The legacy of Sparta, then, is complicated. It has been admired for its discipline, its courage, and its ability to endure against overwhelming odds. Yet it should also be remembered for the cost of that system, the suffering of its subjects, the inflexibility of its order, and the decline that followed once its rigid walls could no longer hold back the pressures of history. So, why did it suck to be a Spartan? Because to live in Sparta was not to live in glory, but to endure a life stripped of comfort, bound by rules, and haunted by fears. The world remembers their battles, but those who lived them remembered the waiting, the hunger, the monotony, and the burden of a society that demanded endurance above all else. And perhaps the truest reflection is this: Sparta left behind fewer monuments, fewer works of art, and fewer voices than nearly any other Greek city-state. Its strength was real, but its legacy was silence. The silence of a people who lived in discipline, endured in hardship, and disappeared when history moved on.